Kia ora, church family, and welcome back to another one of our online Sundays. If you're watching us at home at 10 o'clock on Sunday, it's not too late. We're having our Matariki service, and if you want, you can come on down to the church and be part of the celebrations and the food that will be taking place at the church this morning. For our Matariki celebration, there's certain segments of the service, and here are the main points of those. The first one is going to be looking back and remembering. And this year we've decided to look back and remember those who have passed over this last calendar year. And for that, there have been 7, but actually an 8th person has just been added this week to those that were part of us but have passed away over this last year. And so we'll be remembering Ezra Ibarra and Janet McLeod and Pat Stringer and Ian Devonshire and Murray Granger and Elizabeth Bussey and Joachim Newport. And this week we just learned of Margaret Wolford as well. Then there's going to be a segment when we look around and hear testimony of what God is doing now. Then we're going to have an opportunity to celebrate Helen. Now, Helen Kerr has been a worship leader at this church, and we're trying to work out how long it's been, but it's been 3 decades. So it's a long, long time. And so we're going to take just a few moments to honor Helen, a living legend in our midst. Then we're going to be looking forward. And as part of looking forward, we're going to, again, we could look more generally forward and anticipating the good things that God has in store for us. But we decided to look rather more specifically, and we'll be welcoming Byron to his new role here at Long Bay Baptist Church as our youth worker. He is very much looking forward to this role, and we are anticipating all the things that God is going to do in him and through him to benefit the lives of the young people who are here in our midst. Then, the sermon that's going to be happening online today is not one that's linking with Matariki particularly. The service was a little bit bitty and we weren't quite able to do that, but there is a sermon which will be happening in just a few minutes, and it's by one of the lecturers at Kerry Baptist College here. Then on the 27th of July, we have a series which is being led for us. It's a midweek series. It's happening on a Thursday night at 7:30 by Mike Harbitz. Mike is the head of theology at Laidlaw College, and he is going to come in and do a series. It's 2 weeks, then a break of 2 weeks, and then another 2 weeks, but we'll be putting all the details out. And he's going to be looking at Jesus and who he is and what that means for us. Then, if I could get you to cast your eyes just a little bit further ahead, I know we are just about to finish school holidays, but in the next school holidays is when our church camp is going to be. And church camp is a good time. It's kind of a little bit low key, it's a little bit laid back, but it's an opportunity for us to spend some time together, to play together, to talk, to pray, to worship together. It's enjoyed by people of all ages. So if you have never been before, this will be an opportunity to come to your first church camp. And if you have been before, I don't need to sell it to you. You know how good it is. Soon you'll see some advertising and opportunities to sign up, and I would encourage you to do so and make the most of what this weekend can be. But for today, reading from Psalm 47, the first 2 verses read as follows. Clap your hands, all you nations. Shout to God with cries of joy. For the Lord Most High is awesome, the great King over all the earth. And so we come this morning to clap our hands, to raise our voices, and to acknowledge, as the psalmist acknowledged all those years ago, that the Lord Most High is awesome. And to do that, we'll first do it in song.
Tēnā koutou katoa, everyone out there. My name is Michael Rhodes. I'm the lecturer in Old Testament at Cary Baptist College, your theological college, and it is such a privilege to be able to open the Word with you this morning, even in this strange virtual format. We're going to be looking at a couple texts, one from Isaiah 52, another from 2 Kings 6, 8 through 23 this morning. But I wanted to start by talking a little bit about how my mind has changed. There was a series when I was in theological college in our chapel called How My Mind Has Changed, where lecturers would talk about how their minds had changed over important issues. And I kind of liked that. And I want to start out by thinking about how my mind has changed about something very important, namely the gospel. What do we mean when we use that all-important word gospel? I used to think that the gospel was the idea that Jesus had forgiven me for my sins by dying on the cross so that I could be with him forever and ever when I died. That's what I used to think, and I still do. But then somewhere along the way, people pointed out to me that the word gospel means good news. And the good news that Jesus came preaching was the good news of the kingdom of God. That good news about God's kingdom included my salvation, but it was so much bigger. And I came to think that Isaiah gave us the shortest possible summary of this good news, right there in Isaiah 52:7. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger who announces peace, who brings good news, who announces salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. Maybe that's the shortest possible summary of gospel, the announcement that people, your God reigns. Isaiah 61 characterizes this good news that God reigns as good news to the poor, to the powerless, to the captive, the oppressed. It's the good news of the Jubilee year, which the Messiah can pronounce because he's in charge. And I came to believe that the good news of my salvation is hidden inside this larger, more fundamental good news reality that God reigns. And because the God who reigns sent his son Jesus to die on the cross, I, sinner though I am, can become a citizen of this God's kingdom. This bigger perspective on what the gospel is isn't worse news, it's better news. So I used to think that the gospel was at its heart the good news that God reigns. And I still do think that. But recently, my mind is changing once again about this idea of the gospel. Recently, I've been studying how the word translated good news or announce good news shows up in the Old Testament. And I noticed something recently that I hadn't noticed before. In the historical books of the Old Testament, where this language of good news shows up earliest in the Bible, it's nearly always good news related to battle. It's the news that the enemy has been defeated, cast down, destroyed, that the rival to the throne has been dealt with, so now the king may take up and reign. The reason why you need a messenger of the gospel to announce the good news that the king reigns is that other would-be kings had previously been reigning or appeared to be reigning. So the good news of the gospel isn't just the good news that God reigns, it's the good news that the victory is over, that the battle has been won. Now the king may reign. Now, this idea that the good news often comes in the context of battle, of victory, should have been obvious to me as a reader of the Old Testament. After all, in the Old Testament, Yahweh doesn't look like he's reigning all the time. When the people of God are slaves in Egypt, when Israel is being kicked around by their neighbors, when the people of God are taken into exile, at these times, other gods appear to be reigning. Other gods and other brutal kings aligned with them appear to be the ones in charge. And so the good news of the gospel at those times to the people of God is that Yahweh reigns despite appearances, that the pharaohs will be cast down, that the emperors will be pushed aside, that God has already begun to reign and will one day bring his reign fully and finally over and against the powers that exploit, oppress, dispossess, and destroy. It should have been obvious to me, this idea that the gospel is the good news announced in the aftermath of victory as a reader of the Old Testament. That the gospel isn't just news about a king and a kingdom, but about a king who overthrows other rivals to the throne and brings a kingdom in place of other kingdoms shouldn't have surprised me as a reader of the New Testament either. After all, as John writes, now is the judgment of this world. Now the ruler of this world will be driven out. That's what Jesus says on his way to the cross in John 12:31. Later in 1 John, John will write, "For this reason the Son of God appeared, to destroy the works of the devil." Or Paul says it this way, at the end, when Jesus hands over the kingdom to God the Father, it will be after he has destroyed every ruler and every authority and power. For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. And the last enemy to be destroyed is death. In the New Testament, the good news isn't just that God reigns. It's that God has defeated his enemies and is running them out of town. This means that whatever it looks like in our world, sin, death, the devil, and any person, system, or structure that's aligned with sin, death, and the devil, do not have the last word. These cosmic enemies aren't finally in control of the universe, aren't, in the end of the day, the real movers and shakers. Now, the good news of the gospel is that Jesus is the king who has won the victory and who brings the good news that God reigns precisely because he has won the victory. As a reader of the Old Testament and the New Testament, I should have seen it sooner. This idea that the good news is not just that God reigns, but that God reigns because he's overcome the enemy. Should have seen it sooner, but maybe the reason it took me a while is that if this way of thinking about the gospel is good news, it's also hard news. To recognize that the good news of the kingdom is a victory declaration is to remember that at the Exodus, there are dead Egyptian bodies on the beach. To recognize that the good news of the kingdom is a victory declaration over sin, death, and the devil is to recognize that you and I often have aligned ourselves with sin and death and the devil, these cosmic enemies of God's. In the face of God's reign, understood as a victory over God's enemies, we have to ask ourselves, where and how have we pledged our allegiance to other gods, other lords, other kingdoms, to hear the gospel as the good news that God reigns over other alternatives is to be forced to decide whose side are we on. And deciding whose side we're on, choosing this day whom we will serve, may cost us. I've been thinking about this lately with the story of Saul and David and Jonathan. If you remember that story, Saul has been the anointed king, but has failed. And so God has anointed another king, David, to bring a different kingdom in place of Saul's. Jonathan is Saul's son, who's in line to inherit the kingdom that is now passing over to David because of his father's failure. And in the midst of all of this, Saul realizes that God has shifted from his kingdom, Saul's kingdom, to David as his anointed. And Saul cannot handle this, even though he knows that he's failed and that God is going to work going forward through David's kingdom. Saul nevertheless continues to resist David, to set himself against David. And Saul goes increasingly insane. He's trying to kill him. It's wild. It's a wild story. And at points we even get the idea that Saul knows that God's kingdom purposes are going to be worked through David, not through him and his house. But he can't hear that news as anything but bad news. It would cost Saul too much to recognize that God's kingdom is going forward through David and not through him. But note how Saul's son Jonathan responds. Jonathan has in some ways the most to lose by recognizing that David is God's anointed. It's Jonathan who would inherit the throne if Saul stays in power. But instead of Jonathan resisting God's kingdom purposes at work through David, Saul pledges his allegiance to David and God's kingdom as it will work out through David. Jonathan covenants with David. He pledges his allegiance to him. In one particularly moving scene, Jonathan takes his robe, which in the book of Samuel is always kind of the symbol of an office. Jonathan takes the symbol of his office as the heir apparent and gives it to David. Maybe this is a picture of what it costs us to recognize God's reign, especially when we're in positions of power and position and status that might be threatened by God's kingdom. When we're in those situations like Jonathan, we have to choose which side we're on, and choosing to align ourselves with God's kingdom may cost us, may require us to give up power and privilege and authority that we have that's vested in the old regime that is passing away. This can be hard news, this way of hearing the good news of the gospel that God reigns. This way of hearing the gospel as God's announcement of victory over his enemies is also good news, because when we choose to align ourselves with the God who reigns in Jesus, we experience freedom. And that in at least two ways. First, when we decide that we're on God's side, when we pledge our allegiance to God's kingdom, we are freed from fear. I've been thinking about this in dialogue with another very powerful Old Testament story that we read about in 2 Kings 6, 8 through 23. It's one of the many stories about Elisha. And you got to know a bit about the background. At this period, Elisha and the kingdom of Israel are at war with the king of Aram. And the king of Aram is bigger and more powerful. And so he's always trying to go to war with Israel. But every time he sets a trap, every time he tries to catch Israel, catch the armies of Israel, he finds that they've already moved on, that they've escaped him. And so the king of Aram gets his counselors around and he says, which one of you guys is a spy? Which one of you is narking on me? Which one of you is telling my enemies about my plans so that Israel is never where they're meant to be when I come after them? And bizarrely, some of his counselors know the truth. They say, none of us are spies, O king, but there is a prophet in Israel named Elisha. And the words that you whisper in your council chamber, he tells to the king of Israel. In other words, these guys in the king of Aram's cabinet recognize that there's a prophet in Israel who knows what the king of Aram is planning and lets the king of Israel know so that he can escape the traps that the king of Aram is setting. Now, interestingly, for our purposes, the king of Aram doesn't respond to this news about the prophet by going to inquire of the prophet how he should rule or live his life. No, he's got a really good solution to this. I'm going to go kill the prophet. I'm going to find that prophet who knows what I whisper in my bedroom, in my council chamber, and I'm going to kill him. And this king of Aram comes with these masses of armies, and they're in their chariots, which are like, the tanks of the ancient world. So he's bringing his full force of his army. And the picture that you get in 2 Kings is like, you've got this massive king with this huge army, and he's coming to surround this one house that Elisha's in. Elisha's got this servant who attends him, and he wakes up before Elisha on this fateful day, and he goes up to the roof and he sees the armies, these massive chariots and everything surrounding them. And it's this huge, powerful army and little old Elisha and he who live in the house. And he freaks out. He runs downstairs and he wakes up Elijah and he says, oh, get up, get up, get up. And this is what he says. He says, alas, master, what shall we do? What shall we do about this army with horses and chariots that's all around us? And Elijah replies, do not be afraid, for there are more with us than there are with them. Then Elisha prayed, oh Lord, please open his eyes that he may see. And the Lord opened the eyes of Elisha's servant, and he saw, and the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. Don't you love that? Elisha prays, and God opens the servant's eyes to see the reality. They may be surrounded by chariots and horses, by tanks and armaments, but the armies of the Lord, those who are on Elisha's side, are greater than those who come against them. Brothers and sisters, this is a picture. If we pledge our allegiance to King Jesus, if we embrace the good news that God reigns, no matter what it looks like, we can have our eyes open to the truth. God reigns. Sin, death, the devil have received the death blow. Their days are numbered. There are more with us than there are with them. Deciding whose side we're on frees us from fear because we begin to see that because God reigns, the powers of injustice, the powers of sin, the powers of death, they may threaten, they may surround, they may even wound, but they will not finally win. God will win because God reigns. And we choose to align ourselves with the Lord of heaven and earth. We are freed from debilitating fear. But intriguingly, we embrace this good news that God reigns and has won the victory over our enemies. We're not just freed from fear of our enemies, we're also freed to love our enemies. Embracing God's reign frees us to love those still aligning themselves with sin and death and other kingdoms and other ways of being in the world. Do you remember what happens in 2 Kings 6 after Elisha asked God and the servant sees God's armies surrounding the armies of Aram? It's incredible. Elisha goes down from his house. He walks out towards the armies of the king of Aram and he prays again. He says, Lord, strike this army with blindness. And the Lord does. All the drivers of the chariots and the generals, and they can't see. And Elisha walks up to them and says, hey guys, the person you're looking for isn't here. I'll take it to him. So Elisha leads this entire huge, now blinded army right into the capital city of Israel. They go into the capital, they shut the gates. Israel's enemy army is now locked up inside their capital. And Elisha prays again and says, oh Lord, would you open their eyes now? And these guys open their eyes and they're in the capital of Israel and they're surrounded by the Israelite army. It's incredible. And when the king of Israel sees what happens, he says to Elijah, Father, shall I kill them? Shall I kill them? And we think, yeah, you should kill them. These are the guys that were threatening your lives. These are the guys that wanted to kill the prophet of the Lord. These are the guys that have been hounding you, and the Lord has given them into your hand. We think that Elijah's going to say, you better believe it. You better kill them. But that's not what Elijah says. The king of Israel says to Elisha, shall I kill these armies of Aram? And the king of Israel answers, Elisha answers the king of Israel, no. Did you capture them with your sword and your bow, those whom you want to kill? Instead, set food and water before them, so that they may eat and drink, and let them go back to their master. So the king of Israel prepared for his enemies a great feast. And after they ate and drank, he sent them on their way, and they went to their master. And the Arameans no longer came raiding into the land of Israel. When we recognize that God reigns and align ourselves with his kingdom, we, like Elijah, are freed not only from fear of our enemies, but freed to love our enemies. We don't have to be afraid of those who align themselves with God's cosmic enemies, sin, death, and the devil. We can recognize that God loves his enemies, that God feeds his enemies at a feast, and we are free to do the same. Because God reigns, our enemies are not finally threats. They are potential fellow citizens in Jesus' generous kingdom. I can't help but wonder if Jesus thought of this Elisha story when he sat down at the Last Supper with his disciples. After all, in many ways, these disciples acted like Jesus' enemies. One betrayed him, another 11 abandoned him. I wonder if Jesus thought when those disciples were panicking because they were surrounded by soldiers, and Jesus had to remind them that there were legions of heavenly angels that he could call to his side. Jesus had to remind his disciples there are more with us than there are with them. But then Jesus chose not to call those legions of angels so that he could die for his enemies as an act of love for them. I wonder if Jesus thought about this Elisha story. I don't know. But what I do know is this. With his death and resurrection, Jesus provided a feast for us where we, his former enemies, can become his friends, where citizens of rival kingdoms can renounce our commitment to sin and death and the devil's ways and become citizens of God's kingdom. By Jesus' blood, you and I can hear the good news that God reigns. Because God has dealt the death blow to sin and death and the devil, you and I can become citizens of his kingdom. We can be saved from judgment and for the life for which we were created. And we can live lives freed from fear and freed for love, even of our enemies. To hear the gospel, the good news, with the Old Testament humming in the background, is to be confronted with a choice: God's kingdom or anyone else's. Having sided with God by pledging our allegiance to Jesus, God's good news frees us from fear and for love, so that we can live like citizens of the God who reigns in Jesus. And we can urge our neighbors to sit down at the feast that God offers them and become citizens of his generous kingdom themselves. And that, friends, is very, very good news. Amen.